Man Out of Time, The Time Bubble, Book 3. Written by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Guy Bethell. Chapter 1. September 2063. Daniel Fisher's head was in a spin. He leaned against the crumbling brick wall of the aging railway underpass and tried to make sense of everything that had happened over the past few minutes. He was a large man with broad shoulders and shortly cropped dark hair, which was beginning to show signs of receding. Almost 40 years old, his middle-aged spread was well and truly starting to show. In truth, he had always been on the chubby side, and now, without the metabolism of youth to hold it in check, he was rapidly expanding. For the past few years, he had been working in a factory as a forklift truck driver, living alone, with his life going nowhere fast. For a brief period in the past, he had been someone. Over a decade ago, he had seized power temporarily in the local area. It had all happened during the national breakdown in law and order that had occurred during that terrible winter when it seemed like the world was coming to an end. In his mind, almost everything he had done during that time had been perfectly justified. The one exception was the terrible act he had committed, which he had done the utmost to block from his mind. If he did find himself thinking about it, he dealt with it by trying to convince himself that it wasn't him who had done it. His friend Ryan had gone to prison for it, so as far as he was concerned, it must have been Ryan who had done it. Justice had been served. As long as he kept telling himself that, over and over again, perhaps eventually his mind would come to believe that was the truth. It wasn't too difficult when he was awake, but sometimes at night he woke up in a cold sweat, with the image of snowflakes falling on the dead girl's face imprinted on his mind. He could see every detail of her dead body as she lay in the woods, the blood staining the snow where it had seeped from her head. Then it was much harder to fight off the guilt. Living alone meant that he didn't have to make any effort when it came to cooking. His diet consisted predominantly of burgers, chips, and lager. It was hardly surprising he had let himself go. Right now he was wearing a pair of ill-fitting jeans which had sunk down, exposing a classic builder's bum cleavage. The upper part of his bulk was squeezed into a plain white T-shirt, at least 2 sizes too small. It had ridden up over his stomach, exposing a couple of inches of midriff. Pretty on a girl half his age, but quite hideous on him. There was an unidentifiable yellow stain on the front of the shirt, about halfway between his nipples, which were beginning to jut out. He was developing a classic case of the moobs. This was the outfit he had worn to the birthday party he had been to during the evening. Despite his shabby appearance, not to mention his vile personality, he had somehow found himself leaving the party with a seemingly real prospect of shagging Jess, the 21-year-old birthday girl. She seemed to have quite taken his fancy. Quite how he'd managed to pull her, he wasn't sure, but it was a huge triumph as far as he was concerned. The icing on the cake was that she was the daughter of the head of the local police, who had tried and failed to put him away for murder. As acts of revenge went, this was about as sweet as it could get for someone like Dan. What a fantastic evening it had been. Until now, that was. After the party, Jess had led him into the railway underpass, with promises of delights that had seemed too good to be true. As it turned out, they were. Just as it seemed he'd been about to hit the jackpot, weird things started to happen. Jess had told him to close his eyes and wait for a surprise, and he most certainly got one. When he opened them again, a vaguely familiar-looking man had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, right in front of him. At first he had not been able to place him, and when Jess had addressed him as Dad, it hadn't made it any easier. He hadn't even known she had a father, not one who was around, anyway. As he looked closer, he recognized the man. He was his old English teacher from school. Strangely, he seemed no older than the last time Dan had seen him, which had been over 20 years ago. That was the first in a series of strange events. as he'd struggled to contemplate exactly why his old schoolteacher had appeared out of nowhere, he'd become aware of two other men running down the tunnel towards him. As they'd approached, he quickly recognised them as his old schoolmates, Charlie and Josh. They had been at the party. As he wondered why they'd followed him here, they had run straight at him, and with no explanation had cannoned straight into him, sending him sprawling. Dan was pretty handy with his fists, and he certainly wasn't going to stand for that. When they clattered into him, he'd fallen backwards a few yards and lost his footing. Quickly, he'd got back up and turned round, spoiling for a fight. But Charlie and Josh had vanished, as had Jess. Only Mr. Grant, the English teacher, was still there, but now he looked considerably different, having been wondering a minute or two before why he hadn't aged. Now he'd find himself looking at the same man, but visibly much older. All of this had happened in the space of barely a minute, so by this stage Dan had become thoroughly bemused by it all. Was he hallucinating? Had that little prick-teasing bitch, Jess, been playing games with him all along and slipped something into his drink? How could he have been so stupid as to fall for that? He knew deep down that gorgeous 21-year-old women didn't last after his body. They never had done, even when he'd been that age himself. He had let his desperation for sex cloud his judgment. What a gullible idiot he had been! It had been noisy in the tunnel. A high-speed train, the early morning express from Birmingham to London, was racing overhead at almost 200 miles per hour. When the noise abated, Dan spoke first. "What the fuck is going on here?" he asked. "What have you fuckers done to me?" "I see your grasp of the English language is as limited as ever," Peter had remarked. "As for what's going on, I'm afraid you're going to have to work that out for yourself." That was an awful lot to try and work out. Dan seized on the one thing that was glaringly obvious, the sudden change in appearance of his former teacher. "I don't get this," he said. "One minute you're young, the next you're old. And where's everybody else gone?" "You know, Daniel," Pete had replied, slipping easily back into the tone he used when addressing him at school, "I really wanted to write on your school report once. Not the brightest tool in the box. Sadly, I wasn't allowed to, due to political correctness. But I can see that I was right then, and I'm still right now. I'd love to stay around and amuse myself watching you try to figure all this out, but unfortunately I can't. I've got a date with the future, and I can't afford to be late." Despite being in a poor state of health and not feeling particularly brilliant, Peter had been savouring the moment immensely. He had been looking forward to it for a long time. Dan had replied with what he hoped would sound like a threatening tone, but his unfortunate choice of words made him sound more like a pantomime villain. "Oh, no, you're not. You're not going anywhere until you tell me exactly what is going on here." Pete had replied to Dan's statement in the traditional pantomime style. "Oh, yes, I am. And by the way, you're officially dead. Good luck." And with that, he had stepped forward and vanished, leaving Dan alone and utterly perplexed in the tunnel. Chapter 2. August 2049. Josh Gardner's entire adult life had been focused on one thing and one thing only. Ever since he and his best friend Charlie had discovered the time bubble in the railway underpass, his life had been intertwined with the mysteries and intricacies of time travel. He had met his future self twice, when he had come back from the future to meet him. This future version of himself had assured him that one day he would unlock the secrets of time travel. He had already had some personal experience of time travel, having jumped forward in time himself in both of the time bubbles he had discovered. But those were journeys he couldn't control. He was bound by the fixed nature of the bubbles. He wanted more than that. He wanted to find a way to control exactly when and where he could travel in time. As far as he knew, no one else in the world had managed to unlock the secrets. But that didn't mean he was the only time traveller out there. He'd had a most surreal experience when he was barely out of his teens with a mysterious man he had met at a racetrack. The man had claimed to have knowledge of the future, and had tipped him winner after winner that afternoon, saying that he knew the results before the races were run. As soon as Josh had arrived at the University of Oxford in September 2020, he had befriended a scientist based there, Professor Anthony Hamilton. He had been conducting experiments with tachyon particles at the time. Professor Hamilton had long since retired, but Josh had used the university's generous research facilities to continue the experiments. He eventually abandoned the field of tachyonics in favour of exploring the possibility of bending space-time, recalling a memorable analogy that Peter Grant, his English teacher, had once demonstrated to him. He had folded a piece of paper in half and suggested that if you could jump from one end of the paper to the other where the ends touched, you could traverse the entire length of the sheet in no time at all. This enduring image had stuck with Josh ever since, and finally now, after almost 30 years of research, he was ready to attempt his first jump through time. Josh was 47 years old, but still looked pretty good for his age. His hair was grey, and he was developing a noticeable paunch around the middle. Unlike Dan, he dressed well and looked smart, enabling him to carry the extra weight well. The good looks with which he had charmed the girls in his youth were still there, but he was long past playing the field now. He was happily married to his long-term partner, Alice, who had happily aided him in his time-travel quest. A professor in the astrophysics department at the university, Alice was as fascinated by time travel as her husband. Considering how much time they had spent on it over the past few decades, it was probably just as well. She, too, had maintained her good looks, and her figure, too. At the age of 45, she got plenty of admiring glances from the students around the campus, and would probably have been flattered to know that they referred to her as a MILF. One thing she hadn't done was become a mother. It wasn't as if she and Josh hadn't had a good sex life. Despite the long hours spent unlocking the mysteries of time travel, they'd found plenty of time to play, too. As she grew older and failed to fall pregnant, they thought about trying some of the revolutionary new procedures available that had helped so many women struggling with infertility. However, the truth was that they were happy as they were. She had always felt that if it happened naturally, it would be fantastic. But if it didn't, they would still be happy. As fate dictated, in the end it didn't happen, and so the years that they might have spent child-rearing were instead devoted to the time-travel experiments. They had settled instead on being godparents to Charlie and his wife Kaylee's children. The two couples frequently got together to socialize at weekends, often joined by their other old friends from past adventures, Josh's former teacher, Peter, his wife Hannah, and their daughter, Jess. It was one of these occasions that Josh and Alice were attending this warm Sunday afternoon in late summer 2049. It was Charlie and Katie's daughter's birthday. Sophie had been born on the 22nd of August 2031, about a year and a half after her brother, whom they had named after Peter. With ever-improving advances in technology, telecommuting had never been easier, and Kaylee was able to successfully combine parenting with continuing to pursue her career with the Met Office. She had been instrumental in the pioneering research that now enabled the weather to be forecast with a 90% plus degree of accuracy as far as 15 days in advance. In recognition of her accomplishments, she was now the UK's representative on a worldwide team working towards the very real possibility of controlling the world's weather within the next 20 years. It was a controversial scheme, with many claiming that humans should not have that much power, but such arguments had been heard many times before over all manner of things, right back to the days of the Industrial Revolution. From GM crops to artificial intelligence, there was simply no way to hold back the inevitable tide of progress, whether it was morally right or not. And who could argue against technology that could end suffering in parts of the world that even in the mid-21st century still suffered periods of famine and drought? Kaylee believed completely in what she was doing, and a large part of her life was devoted to it. By contrast, Charlie had taken a step back from the corporate career that he had never really enjoyed. Taking time out to share the parenting duties with Kaylee, he had discovered a talent for writing. Inspired by their past adventures with a time bubble, he had carved out a niche for himself, writing science fiction novels. After a few years steadily building up a fan base, he had really struck gold recently, when an up-and-coming British hollow movie company had expressed an interest in turning one of his novels into a movie. He hadn't said yes, yet it was something he needed to talk about with Josh and Peter at the party. The plotline of the book in question had been inspired by their past adventures. Having it in print was one thing, but thrusting it firmly into the public domain was another. Was there a risk that their secret could be uncovered? Completing the lineup of guests for the party were Hannah, Peter, and their daughter Jess. Hannah and Peter were both retired now, she after a distinguished career with the police, in which she had risen to chief superintendent of her local force. Jess, meanwhile, had followed her father into the teaching profession. During Hannah's time in the police, she had been involved in all manner of modern technological innovations. Her force had been the first to introduce self-drive traffic vehicles that could police the roads and issue fines for motoring offences without the need for any human presence whatsoever. She had also championed the use of drone technology for surveillance and gathering evidence. Just as Kaylee had faced criticism for her experiments in weather control, Hannah, too, had found herself the subject of political debate, with the media complaining that the UK was being turned into a police state. This accusation was nothing new. It had been raised many times since the police had first been formed. But Hannah was satisfied with the work she had done. The roads had never been safer, and crime detection was at an all-time high. The one lingering regret from her time in the police force was that she had been unable to prevent the miscarriage of justice that had occurred over Lauren's death. She herself had been the one who found the girl's broken body in the woods. Lauren had been murdered during the breakdown of law and order that had spread across the country during the Black Winter, as it had now become known, almost 20 years ago. In the end, she had administered her own justice by assisting with a plan that had led to the propelling of the true killer into the time bubble. She had alleviated her guilt somewhat by ensuring that the innocent man, Dan's friend Ryan, who had been wrongly convicted of the crime, was later pardoned. Unable to reveal the identity of the true killer without risking exposing the secret of the time bubble to the public, she ensured that Ryan was freed after an appeal due to questionable evidence. She manipulated this as best as she could from behind the scenes, and ensured he received some extremely generous compensation. But she still felt unhappy that justice had not properly been done. Dan should have suffered a lot more for what he had done. In 2046, at the age of 55, she had retired to spend more time with Peter. They had spent so many of her younger years apart when he was stuck in the time bubble that she was determined not to waste the time they had left. With a healthy pension in recognition of her fine service, they were comfortably well off. Such a pension was rare indeed by the 2040s. In an era when people were living longer than ever, having to work into their 70s, she had done remarkably well. As for Peter, he had already been drawing a pension for several years. According to his birth certificate, he was now 79 years old, but his body's true age was only mid-50s. He had just about managed to get away with this, putting it down to healthy living and exercise. It was more believable than it might have been a generation or two before. There were more fit and healthy septuagenarians and octogenarians around than ever before. They were running marathons, climbing Everest, and generally refusing to retire to their allotments as their grandfathers once had. Generally, Peter avoided mentioning his true age unless he absolutely had to. Those that did need to know for some reason, mainly medical professionals, usually complimented him on how good he looked for his age, but that was as far as it went. His biggest worry came every time he had to renew his passport, but it had always been accepted without question. This was just as well, as Peter and Hannah had spent most of the past 3 years travelling the world. With Jess now grown up and able to look after herself, they had the money and the time to go wherever they wanted. Air travel had been revolutionized in the 2040s by the development of new hypersonic planes, environmentally friendly and safe. It was now possible to complete a flight from Australia to England in just 4 hours. It was such a flight that Peter and Hannah had recently undertaken, and they arrived at the Adams residence full of stories to relate about their most recent adventure. Charlie and Kaylee had bought their current home in a small hamlet just a few miles outside Oxford 12 years ago. It was a gorgeous 3-bedroomed 19th-century cottage with whitewashed walls and mature gardens which were perfect for entertaining. The interior was a mix of old and new. The original oak beams and open fireplace of the living room had been restored to their original glory. They contrasted nicely with the latest high-tech kitchen, filled with amazing devices that could do things that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. It would have been very difficult in the first quarter of the century for people like Kaylee and Charlie to afford to buy such a property. Things had changed dramatically after the Black Winter, when there had suddenly been more cheap property available than in living memory. The deaths of 2 million people had had a significant impact on the housing market. After a generation of seemingly unstoppable growth in house prices, the crash that doomsayers had been predicting for decades finally came. And so it was that when Kaylee and Charlie bought the house in 2037, the records showed that they paid less for it than the previous owners had in 2015. The house was looking at its best on this gorgeous sunny afternoon as Peter, Hannah and Jess glided silently into the drive in their electric, driverless BMW. The only sound to be heard was the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tyres, throwing up clouds of dust from the dried-out ground. After 2 decades of generally miserable summers, England was experiencing a rare and welcome heat wave, and it hadn't rained in weeks. Despite that, the rose bushes and hanging baskets framing the front door were in full bloom. "Someone's got green fingers," remarked Peter as they got out of the car. He grabbed a wine carrier out of the boot, and they walked towards the front door. "That'll be Kaylee," replied Hannah. "The garden's always been her pride and joy, but this is the best I've ever seen it." Peter paused and sniffed the air. The unmistakable aroma of burning charcoal was wafting through the air. "Sounds like he's got the barbecue going already," he remarked. "There's no point knocking on the door," he added, and opened the arch-shaped gate set within the hedge that ran sideways from the left-hand side of the house. A small path of irregularly laid paving stones lay along the side of the house, leading round to the rear garden. The others were already there, waiting for them. The top part of the garden consisted of a sizable patio area behind a rectangular white-framed glass conservatory that ran the length of the rear of the house. As Peter had correctly surmised, Charlie was already enthusiastically grilling away on his latest toy, a high-tech barbecue covered with sensors and electronic readouts. Kaylee and Alice were busy placing bowls of salad and trays of rolls out on a large trestle table. As they did so, Josh emerged through the French windows of the conservatory, carrying a large crate of lager. Peter's younger namesake, known to all as Pete, and his sister Sophie, were on the large lawn area that lay beyond the patio. They were playing swing ball, ever popular even in the high-tech 21st century. Jess immediately headed over to join them. "Good day, all," announced Peter, in a very poor attempt at an Australian accent. "Good day, sport," replied Josh, mimicking him. He had a lot of catching up to do. It was the first time that Josh and the others had seen Peter and Hannah since they had left for the trip down under, over 6 months previously. Jess had been a frequent visitor during that time, though, particularly recently. After an extremely busy year's teaching, she was enjoying a long and relaxing summer holiday, spending a lot of time with Pete and Sophie. "Good to see you've got the beer under control," said Peter. "Can you make use of some of this?" he asked, placing the wine carrier on the table. Kaylee picked out a bottle and examined it, a very acceptable-looking, sparkling Australian white wine. "Duty-free?" she inquired. No, Sainsbury's, actually," replied Peter. It didn't seem worth lugging the stuff back from Australia when you can buy it just as cheaply here, and our suitcases were brimming with souvenirs. But it's the thought that counts. I'm sure we could have managed without some of your souvenirs, remarked Hannah. He insisted on buying one of those ridiculous hats with the hawks on it, amongst other things. It seemed like a good idea at the time, reflected Peter. In fact, I could do with it now, he added, as he swatted away a nosy wasp that was hanging around him. There are all sorts of nasty insects in Australia, but none that bother me as much as these bloody things. They ruin the summer. Hey, Peter, come and have a look at this, called Charlie from the barbecue area, over in the corner of the patio. He was keen to show off his latest acquisition. Let me grab a beer first, he replied, but Kaylee had already twisted the top off one and was passing it to him as he spoke. Ever the perfect hostess, he complimented her. You're welcome, sir, she joked, in reference to the days so many years ago when he had been her English teacher. As Josh wandered over to the lawn to catch up with the younger generation, Peter moved to join Charlie at the grill. He certainly seemed to be enjoying his chef's role and had dressed the part accordingly. He was wearing a traditional chef's hat and a white apron featuring a cartoon chef holding up a sausage on the end of a fork, advertising British Sausage Week 2048. Nice apron, remarked Peter dryly. So, this looks pretty impressive, he said, casting his eye over Charlie's revolutionary new barbecue. It's awesome, said Charlie. Let me show you a couple of things. He turned and addressed the barbecue directly. Barbie, he proclaimed, making Peter chuckle. Can you give me a status update on the sausages in Zone 3, please? Certainly, Charlie, announced a seductive female voice. The sausages in Zone 3 will be cooked to perfection in another 3 minutes and 34 seconds. Would you like me to alert you when they are ready? That would be fantastic, replied Charlie. You're welcome, Charlie, came the reply. And would you like me to get you another beer? I can see that you have only 9% remaining in your current bottle. Yes, please, said Charlie. You really do think of everything. A tray slid out smoothly from the refrigerated base of the machine, holding a fresh bottle of lager, droplets of moisture glistening on the outside. It reminded Peter of how the old CD trays used to slide out of the stereo systems he'd owned in his youth. As he watched, a robotic arm emerged from the side of the machine, efficiently removed the top from the bottle, and handed it to Charlie. Thank you, Barbie, said Charlie. That will be all. You're welcome, replied the machine. And by the way, your burgers are now at the optimum time for flipping. That is pretty impressive, commented Peter. But seriously, did you have to call it Barbie? Just my little idea of a joke, replied Charlie. It's not an it, it's a she. You don't want to offend her. Well, I'm glad the sausages are nearly ready. I'm famished, said Peter. What sort are they? Gloucester Old Spots, replied Charlie. We get them from a local farm up the road. Fantastic, replied Peter. Can't wait. As they continued chatting, Hannah was enthusing to Alice and Kaylee about her trip down under. They had cracked open a bottle of the Australian fizz, and with all the preparations done, were enjoying a catch-up as they waited for the meat to be cooked. Honestly, you wouldn't believe what they are doing down there, said Hannah. Uluru City is like something out of a science fiction film. I've seen plenty of it, remarked Kaylee. You posted enough iCamp footage while you were there. Australia had become a major world power by the mid-21st century. It had been relatively unscathed by the Black Winter that had devastated all of the Northern Hemisphere's major economies. While those countries had spent years recovering, Australia had been developing technologies to enable it to fully realize the potential of that great untapped land mass that was the outback. Thousands of square miles of scorched desert land had been paved over with the most advanced solar panels yet developed. A major irrigation and desalination scheme carried water from the Southern Ocean hundreds of miles inland. The power and the water made construction possible on a scale never previously imagined. In just 2 decades, barely a dozen miles from the famous landmark once known as Ayres Rock, Uluru City had grown out of almost nothing. The rapid construction of glittering skyscrapers, 7-star hotels, and artificially created lakes and beaches was reminiscent of the growth of Dubai in the early part of the century. With the hypersonic flights making nowhere on Earth more than 4 hours distant, it had quickly become a playground for the rich and famous. "I've got to admit," said Alice, as she listened to Hannah excitedly relaying all the details, "that I'm well jealous. But how did you afford all this? I've heard that it's £20,000 a night to stay in the hotels there." "That's the 7-star hotels," replied Hannah. "We're not that flushed. We stayed in a 5-star, but it was still absolutely luxurious. Gorgeous bathrobes, expensive toiletries in the bathroom, chocolates on the pillow, that sort of thing." "Was it really hot?" asked Alice. Cayley, the climate expert, answered before Hannah could speak. "It shouldn't have been. They went in the middle of the Southern Hemisphere winter, so it wouldn't have been scorching. I would imagine it was the perfect time to go, probably about the same as it is here now." "It was about 25 degrees every day," confirmed Hannah. "The hotel had a gorgeous beach and pool, all free-formed to look like the sea, even though we were hundreds of miles from the coast. It even had artificial tides and waves. The whole place is simply amazing."